Hello everyone, my name is Louise Richardson. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford, and I'm delighted to be here this evening, or this morning, where you may well be. Thank you for joining us for this discussion of a subject that is critical to universities. Knowledge, of course, is our reason for being. We exist to discover knowledge, to curate knowledge, and to disseminate it. And this evening, we're going to be hearing from somebody who has written an absolutely wonderful book about its destruction. But this conversation is taking place within the context of our new Humanities Centre, the Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities. We recently received a gift from Stephen Schwarzman, which is the largest gift the university has received since the Renaissance. And it is an investment in the humanities. And this new Humanities Centre is going to have three parts. First of all, it will bring together in an area where the old Radcliffe Hospital used to be, right behind the Blavatnik School, a brand spanking new building, which will bring together the various humanities faculties and critically a new humanities library. The second part of this enterprise is it will create a performing arts centre with a music hall, black box theatre, TV studio, dance studio for our students, and so on. And thirdly, it will create a centre for the ethics of AI, marshalling the insights of 900 years of studying the humanities at Oxford and applying them to the future challenges posed by AI. So this evening we have with us two wonderful people to talk to you. And the first has one of the best titles around. He's the Bodleian Librarian. And he has, I should say, we've just celebrated the 700th anniversary of the Bodleian Library, which is at the hub of our university, just as libraries invariably are the beating heart of every university. So Richard has been at the Bodleian since 2003. Before that, he worked across Britain at Durham University, in the House of Lords Library, in the National Library of Scotland, and the University of Edinburgh Library. And he is a member of the Fellow of the American Philosophical Society, Treasurer of the Consortium of European Research Libraries, and a wonderful colleague and friend, and somebody who is a great defender of the arts and of libraries, and author of a wonderful book about which we're going to hear in a moment. And drawing him out on this book is a graduate of the university, a graduate of Lady Margaret Hall, Amanda Foreman. She too is a distinguished biographer, historian, and writer. She is author of the bestsellers Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, and A World on Fire, The Epic History of Two Nations Divided, as well as of the BBC documentary series, The Ascent of Women. She has also served as the chair of the Man Booker Prize, and one has to be a true bibliophile to take on that enormous task, which she did in 2016 with great aplomb. She is columnist for the Wall Street Journal biweekly, Historically Speaking, and founder of the literary nonprofit House of Speakeasy Foundation. And I don't know about you, but I can't wait for her next book, due out next year. It is The World Made by Women, A History of Women, due to be published by Penguin Random House. So with that, let me turn it over to Amanda, who's going to talk to Richard for the remainder of the hour. So please enjoy. Thank you.
A very warm welcome to all of you who have zoomed in today to hear Richard Ovenden discuss his fascinating book, Burning the Books. And thank you very much to Oxford North America and the Vice-Chancellor for bringing us together on what is, I understand, a very wet day in England, and it's certainly a very snowy day here in New York. I can hardly think of a more pressing subject than the power and control of knowledge. It says in the King James Bible, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Now, on the temporal plane, it's our libraries and our archives who are the shield maidens of truth and the guardians of freedom. They, not the digital giants, not social media, are the first and last bulwarks of democracy. And this, I think, is at the core of Richard's book. Now, Richard, honestly, congratulations on this. Burning the Books covers the entire gamut from the first known library in Mesopotamia to the very latest repositories today. But the case you make is extremely layered and subtle. For example, you begin by discussing the library of the Neo-Assyrian king, King Ashurbanipal, which was burned in the 7th century BC and only rediscovered in the 19th century. But that library itself was an act of domination. It really was, in essence, a statement that knowledge is power, literally. So what you're saying isn't simply, all libraries good, all libraries, no library is bad. It's a much more comprehensive argument that you're making. Isn't that right?
Well, thank you, Amanda. Yes, that's what That's what I've tried to do in the book. And libraries aren't neutral spaces. They exist in their temporal moments. They're run by human beings who are subject to all sorts of human frailties and foibles. But in their essence, the argument I'm trying to make is one about the importance of the preservation of knowledge. And, by looking at the lens of destruction, I think is a way of highlighting how important it is for society as a whole, for communities, for the rights of individuals, and for the health of, democracy, as you were introducing me, itself. And so preservation is the heart of all of those things, and you can really see it when you lose libraries and archives. But yes, they are, they can be great symbols of power, as Ashurbanipal showed us.
Yes, can you just tell us a little bit about how that library, how he created that library, first of all, because it's a sort of extraordinary story, sort of depressing, exhilarating at the same time.
Yeah, I was amazed by it. There was a wonderful exhibition at the British Museum in 2017, 2018, just as I was kind of coming up with the idea of the book. And I walked into their exhibition gallery, and there's a library at the heart of it. And it's an extraordinary library because it's cuneiform tablets, it's clay, it's like, literally concrete poetry. And the curators of the exhibition made a very kind of compelling point that this was the first library that we know of to have comprehensively tried to accumulate the whole of recorded knowledge as it was understood at the time. And of course, the library was destroyed, and then it fell literally into the dust of central Iraq, and it's uncovered by a series of excavations, most compellingly by a Brit, Austin Henry Layard, known as the Lion of Nineveh, because that was the city where the Ashurbanipal's kingdom was run from. And through the painstaking archaeology of the 19th century is really kind of pioneering, not just by Layard, but by an Iraqi, Hormuzd Rassam, who gets kind of edited out of the narrative, unfortunately. But also through the scholarship of deciphering the tablets since then. And we know that there are extraordinary accession records where Ashurbanipal is sending his agents to the recently conquered neighboring kingdom of Babylonia to say, there are these really important books that I need, and I know that they're in this library, so go and get them for me. And so these accession records show that he is depriving his neighbors of knowledge, depriving his enemies of knowledge to make him stronger. And I think one of the interesting things is that so much of his library is about the prediction of the future. So, when's the best time to plant a crop? When is the best time to, marry or to have children? When's the best time to fight your enemies? So astronomy, astrology, divination. And so by making your enemies less good at predicting the future, and by making yourself stronger at predicting the future, it really is all about power and the power of knowledge to, support your broader kind of ambitions.
But it's fascinating because the next point that you make is that the knowledge and truth one would think are, I mean, you know, they go together like, you know, tomatoes and mozzarella. I mean, you know, they belong to each other.
Yeah.
But the truth can become a lie, and then that lie seems to become the truth. So with the Library of Alexandria, you know, for centuries and centuries and centuries, everybody believed that it was destroyed by one deliberate act.
Yeah.
And that isn't actually true. That's not what happens. And
No.
that's important, because what really happens is the thing that we should be guarding against, rather than some, you know, one terrible act, someone's mistake that destroyed it.
Yes, and again, I think this is, you know, this was a new story to me. I remember turning the TV on and watching with my mum and dad in the, you know, late 1970s, Carl Sagan's Civilization program, and you can find the program. I went back to look at it because you can find them on YouTube. And the first program, which was kind of indelibly imprinted on my mind, shows Sagan lamenting the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. And he says, you know, if there was anywhere in history that I could go back to, it would be to the Library of Alexandria. You know, all of these kind of riches of knowledge and poetry and science have been lost to civilization, and it's taken us 2,000 years to recover from that kind of catastrophic loss. And of course, you know, it's not what happened. There was no single moment of destruction. There certainly were fires, and there was, you know, the ancient writers all agree that there was a great library, you know, in the, you know, 3rd, 4th century before the Christian era, and by the 4th century of the Christian era, there wasn't a great library anymore. So, you know, it disappeared in that period of time, but it wasn't the fault of a single act of destruction. And a lot of that is blamed on the civil war between Caesar and Ptolemy. And certainly, you know, books went up in smoke when that happened, but it's really a slow process of decline and neglect. It's, you know, the Great Library of Alexandria starts off being, you know, a phenomenal royal project. You know, the Ptolemies invest in this great institution that makes them famous in the ancient world, that brings writers, that brings knowledge, that brings Archimedes and Euclid and Strabo and all of these extraordinary people. Callimachus as the librarian. You know, it's an amazing enterprise, but it stops being a priority at some point early in the Christian era, and gradually funding disappears, and the collection stops being looked after, the scholars go, and the royal funding dissipates to the point at which we don't actually know where the library was in the modern city of Alexandria. There are no remains, there's no archaeology. All that there is are these traces, you know, in the fragmentary documentary record. And so that's the kind of warning for us today, is that you know, knowledge, even from, you know, one of the great institutions of the ancient world, can go if we don't look after it, if we don't pay attention.
One of the things that I learned from your book, which I had no idea, was that the Library of Alexandria had 2 9-book critical editions of Sappho's works. So they, you know, they were there, and yeah. Now they're just awful. Yeah. But on the plus side, this was where Archimedes began his career as an experimenter. And wasn't he inspired to invent one inventor? He invented the screw. Isn't that right?
Yeah, kind of... absolutely. So, you know, there are these great moments in the library, and it's really a university, because there's the library in the museum, from which we get the term museum, the Temple of the Muses. And there's this community of scholars that, you know, the Ptolemies paid to come and study the knowledge and create new knowledge. and to disseminate the text. And, you know, people like Archimedes and Euclid are members of that community, and the king would come and join them, we know from Ammianus Marcellinus, and sit amongst them. They ate, you know, it's like a college, you know, they ate communally, and then they went off and did their studies, and you can imagine them in the, you know, in the dining hall chatting away. And it's a great idea, I think, that gets reborn in the universities of the Middle Ages. And indeed, in Sir Thomas Bodley's autobiography, there's a reference to, you know, the Bodleian as being, you know, the recreation of the great Egyptian library.
So if you could sum up, what's the main difference then between Ashurbanipal's library and the Library of Alexandria? It was obviously a move forward, wasn't it? And it was sort of
it was a move forward, and I think there are two things about it. One is that the knowledge in Alexandria was shared, so scholars could come and study it and make copies and take the copies away with them. And that's, for a number of texts, the reason that they existed because they were copied from Alexandria and taken to Rome or taken to Pergamon. But also that the community of scholars that surrounded the library. The library wasn't just you know, a warehouse full of scrolls. It was a place where scholars were encouraged to come and to work together, to have a community, and to create new ideas from that body of knowledge. Right,
so that would make sense, and how in being able to compare the Bodleian to the Library of Alexandria, both in its form and its purpose. Which brings me to my next question, which is, could you just go into greater depth about how the Magna Carta, or one of the few surviving copies of the Magna Carta, ended up at the Bodleian? Because that's yeah, it was funny. It wasn't straightforward at all.
It wasn't straight. It's a fabulous. It's one of my favourite stories. So the Bodleian, you know, there are Magna Carta was sealed on the field of Runnymede in 1215, and that original document doesn't survive, but it was sent back to London to the Royal Chancery, and it was copied out, and those copies each had legal status, and they had the royal seal attached to them, and they were sent out to the sheriffs of the counties. And the sheriffs had custody of them, and they had to proclaim them to their local communities. And those sheriffs typically didn't have places to keep important documents. And the nearest places that they had were the archives, the muniment rooms of the local monasteries. And so copies were made in 1215, then again in 1216, in 1217, in 1225, in 1236, in 1262, and in 1297. Each time the king needed to remind the barons that, okay, I know that, you know, King John misbehaved, but I'm not going to, because I remember Magna Carta. And so, more to the point, I'm going to send it out again and repeat everything that John signed up to. But in order to preserve those documents and to preserve that fact of royal agreement to the terms of Magna Carta, they were kept in these monastic archives, and the ones sent to the Sheriff of Oxford were kept in the archives of Osney Abbey. And then in the 16th century, Cardinal Wolsey comes along and wants to create a new college. And Henry, who's at this point thinks Wolsey is the bee's knees, allows Wolsey to create a new college and called Cardinal College. And in doing so, the king dissolved two great monastic houses, St. Friedwide's Abbey and Osney Abbey, and all their properties were given to Cardinal College, which of course later, after Wolsey fell from grace, became Christ Church. And so Christ Church had all these incredible monastic properties and all the rents from them, and they needed the contents of those archive rooms to show what property they owned, so that they could go and claim the rents from the people who were occupying the lands. And in the mix of all of those documents were original copies of Magna Carta. Now, because Christchurch felt that, oh, well, we don't need these documents, aren't about what property we own, they're not important to us. So they put them in a pile in the cloisters of Christchurch. And this happened in the middle of the 16th century. So there's this great heap of useless documents. And in the early 17th century, an incredible man, a fellow of Merton called Anthony Wood, comes along writing the first history of the university. And he comes to Christchurch and I'm guessing here, so this is a bit of historical reconstruction, that he has a conversation with Christchurch and says, look, do you really need all those documents? They're just lying in this kind of heap. And they say, no, you can help yourself. So he takes hundreds and hundreds of documents away with him to his rooms in Merton Street, Postmaster Hall, and he uses them to write the history of the university. And then he gives them to the Bodleian. And in the mix of all of that, we acquire original copies of the 1217 Magna Carta. At least one of those is sent to the county of Oxford. And I actually think the reason why we have two 1216 Magna Cartas is because another one was sent to the university. And I think that's a sign that the university is a great institution, is that it receives the Magna Carta.
One of the things that you do so beautifully throughout the book is that you tell these sorts of stories and then you relate them to a much later event to show why and how, and illustrate how past knowledge infers and moves along future events. And so talking about the Magna Carta, you then mentioned about William Blackstone's commentaries on the Magna Carta held in Oxford, which then was read by the founding fathers in America, which very much influenced how they created the Constitution. And it's sort of absolutely fascinating. It's a kind of literary great chain of being.
Well, that's a great way of putting it, and I couldn't agree with you more, of course. But what I actually think, is that we are here today because of what has happened in the past, and that trail of documents that document facts, but also document falsehoods, that document ideas, that document creativity, document mistakes. All of these things are what make us who we are today as communities and societies. And we can only be sure of ourselves, not only in our present moment, but where we go in the future, through the certainty of that past. And that is a fragile past, and much of it survives down to us by accident, or I try to show in my book by the design of libraries and archives as the institutions that society has created to preserve those stepping stones to the future.
Well, even the Bodleian itself suffered two major catastrophes, didn't it? The first was, I'm trying to remember, in 1549, didn't Commissioner Edward VI went and took almost every single book to Humphrey's library.
So the second wave of the Reformation is devastating, as the first wave really hits the great monastic libraries, the religious institutions, and the second Reformation, the Reformation of Edward VI rather than of his dad Henry, is one which devastates more secular institutions as well. And that certainly happened in Oxford. Oxford becomes a great centre of Protestantism. Of course, we burn famously Cranmer, Latimer and Ridley outside Balliol. And that moment sees the library, which had been a great modern institution in the 15th century, again, kind of reborn by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester as a great philanthropic act. All of that sort of humanistic learning, cutting edge 15th century learning is gone. And, of the 450 books that were in that library, we only know that 11 survive. We only have 4 of them in the Bodleian. And so I think that act of destruction is the prompt, the motivation for renewal that Sir Thomas Bodley is inspired by as another great philanthropic act sort of 40 years later, because he has seen, he can see the empty room. He recounts going up and seeing it laid waste, he says in his autobiography.
But then fire, wasn't there, which just burnt everything down, and then they had to reacquire some more books. Is that right? Wasn't there when they didn't the Bodley then didn't it suffer a second loss? Was it just this one?
I think it's just that's the main loss. The Bodleian, there were other kind of smaller fires that hit the Bodleian, but nothing sort of, you know, and these are a kind of constant risk. And it's quite an interesting story about how the libraries and archives of Oxford, of the colleges too, the kind of the techniques that they devised to preserve their collections from fire and also from flooding. So these are kind of part of the evolution of the preservation of knowledge.
But one book that did not get burned was John Milton's, because there was an order to destroy. Was it Paradise Lost? Or was it
right, yeah. So I think that's the moment of destruction you're thinking of. Yeah, absolutely. So of course, you know, the regicides in the English Civil War, at the moment of the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, they become persona non grata. And their writings too become targets, both in the 1660s and then later in the 1670s. And there are great edicts that their books should be taken and brought into the school's quadrangle, what we now call the Bodleian quadrangle, and burnt. And there were two great burnings of those books: Richard Baxter, you know, John Bunyan, but also Milton. But Milton had a great place to play in the Bodleians' history because he was great chums with my predecessor, the second librarian, John Rouse. And indeed, he presented a copy of his writings, including the Areopagitica, his great kind of paean for free speech, to the Bodleian with poems in his own hand dedicated to the Bodleian and to John Rouse. And by the time of these burnings, Rouse's successor, my predecessor, the fourth librarian, Thomas Hyde, he disobeys this edict, both a royal edict and an edict from the university, and keeps Milton's volume a secret in the library. He removes its entry from the catalogue and he hides the book, and we still got it today. And I think that's such a, you know, it's a thing in our history that inspires me. And it also features in Philip Pullman's, the first book of his new trilogy called La Belle Sauvage. The trilogy is called The Book of Dust. So the first volume of it, published just a few years ago, has a chapter devoted to Bodley's librarian who hides the alethiometer from the magisterium. And that's inspired by the Milton Thomas Hyde story.
Which leads me to my next question, which is when people or the authors themselves decide to burn their own work. And so you start by citing Virgil, whose Aeneid was not burned, even though he said he wanted it to. But then there have been other instances, like the destruction of Lord Byron's memoirs, page by page, which have happened.
Yeah.
But you have a kind of rather interesting solution to that. I think you come down firmly on the side of let's not burn the works, even if the author wants it to happen that way. But your answer to that, I thought, was very elegant, and I wondered if you wanted to enlarge on that.
Well, I think that there are, you know, there are moments in history where individuals have this kind of point at which they must decide about their own legacy into the future. And we all face it, when a loved one, when our, if a family member dies and you have to clear their house, and my wife and I did a few years ago, you stumble upon kind of shoeboxes full of letters or documents, and you have to decide either whether they're worth keeping because nobody's going to be interested in these, or sometimes that actually this information is rocket fuel. It really, it either must be kept and the family must know about this, or actually really it would be better if nobody knew about this. And these come to a head when there are people of the individuals concerned are of great public interest and prominence. And the writers that I chose to tell those stories are kind of interesting questions. So you have people like, Byron, who his family and his friends came together to protect his posthumous memory. He died by this stage. And in fact, it's on this day in the early 19th century that Byron gave his friend Thomas More his memoirs, on this very day. And of course, the family decide that actually, it really would be better if these salacious records of the man who was mad, bad, and dangerous to know didn't survive. Then you have Kafka, who Max Brod, his great friend, who disobeyed Kafka's wishes and preserved his unpublished writings. Brod said, well, France knew that I could never destroy them. And so in trusting me with the task, he really wasn't that serious about it. And then you get Philip Larkin, who's, the two of the women in his life, Monica Jones and Betty Macarith, actually really did know that he wanted his journals to be destroyed. And Betty, who was his secretary at the Hull University Library, not only tore the pages of his journals out and shoved them through the office shredder, but she took the shredded pages down to the library incinerator and pushed them in the fire. So, what I suggest is that actually, and we do this routinely in libraries, there are closure routines. We can keep the contents of those, rather interesting, but to living individuals or to near family members can be very distressing. We can keep those closed for long periods of time. And in fact, we have, excuse me, many archival collections like that. One of them is of Philip Larkin's great friend and Oxford contemporary, Bruce Montgomery, whose letters will remain close till 2035.
I have to be honest with you. I think my favorite chapter in your book is on the Paper Brigade, which I'd never heard of these people. I didn't know about this aspect of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And the whole chapter really is about the lengths that people will go to preserve and rescue books from the flames. And it's just absolutely heroic what happened in Lithuania, in Vilnius. And I wonder if you could just briefly describe that, and because it is amazing. And it wasn't just Jews who were saving their own works, obviously. There was a particular hero, Antanas Ulpis, who was the director of the equivalent of Lithuania's National Library, who was hiding some of these ancient Hebraic tomes in organ pipes.
Yeah, it's just an amazing story. And it's actually thanks to an American scholar, David Fishman, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, that I know any of this. And David's been very generous with his knowledge of this group of individuals who were librarians and scholars who were in the Vilna ghetto and forced at gunpoint by the Nazis to sort through the many library and archival collections in the city, most of them to go for destruction, but some of them to be saved for this very perverse Institute for the Study of the Jews, which Alfred Rosenberg, the chief kind of architect of anti-Semitism, had created in Frankfurt. So they're forced at gunpoint. They're taken out of the ghetto every day. They're forced to do this terrible task, which is decide what should be destroyed and what should be kept. And they they kind of distract the guards, and they hide pages in their clothing, and they smuggle documents back into the ghetto every night, risking their own lives every time they did it. And they amass hundreds of thousands of sheets of paper, and they hide them in the ghetto. And of course, you know, the occupants of the ghetto are murdered by the Nazis when it's liquidated in 1943. A few of them escape, join the partisans, and come and rediscover these hidden troves of documents. And fantastic. They're devastated at the destruction, but at least there is this record of their civilization. But then the Soviets decide that these are anti-communist, and they send them to the paper mills. And then it's this great guy, Antanas Ulpis, this librarian, who goes and literally himself drives the trucks back from the paper mill, hides them in this church, which has been used as a depot for the National Library, and he keeps it a secret until his death. He shares it with just a few members of the library staff, but there are these hundreds of thousands of documents which are only revealed in 1989. And the successor to one of the pre-war archives in Vilna called YIVO, which is re-established in New York. It's down in the Lower East Side. It's an amazing institution, and I've been there, and they are wonderful people. And so some of those saved documents are now in New York. Others are most of them are in Lithuania, but together the YIVO Institute and the National Library of Lithuania are digitizing these collections so that they can be shared more broadly. So it's a, to me, it's a very inspiring story of how much the preservation of the written record of our communities, how important that is, so much that people will risk their lives to save it.
And they did. There's another incident you talk about during the bombing in Bosnia, and the Bosnian National Library was being deliberately shelled with incendiaries, and the librarians were shot at by sniper fire as they tried books.
Yeah, and several members of the library were killed on that day, and this is 1992. This is not a long time ago. My brother served in the UN in that war, so this is yesterday, and the Serbs were deliberately targeting the National Library to erase Bosnia's cultural and intellectual memory. They were targeting provincial archives so that they could eradicate any record of land ownership by Muslims in Bosnia. So this was a very targeted, orchestrated cultural and intellectual genocide that went alongside the human genocide. And this year, of course, we must remember that we are commemorating the massacre at Srebrenica. That's just 25 years ago.
Yes, and along with that, as you say, the eradication of historical, as it were, current or contemporary historical records by governments themselves, or in the Civil War, other parties, in order to create a different history than the one that actually exists, is something that we are, contending with right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, at the moment, there are 3 organizations in the United States who are suing the White House for about the destruction of presidential records. And they're accusing the president of, avoiding the rigors of the Presidential Records Act. And, this is a matter of absolutely contemporary concern, and it's happening in other places across the world. In Guatemala at the moment, there's a great dispute over the secret police archive, which is being used to, had been used to prosecute, sort of crimes against the people of Guatemala, but is now, at the risk of being destroyed. In Yemen, the Zaidi libraries are being targeted. This is happening all over the globe right now. And, one of the things I argue is that, democracy is still at stake through our inability to attend to the preservation of knowledge.
And one of your other main arguments is that, the digital giants, the digital world is not the answer. And I want to read a quote from your book and then have you comment on it. You say, libraries are neutral. Preservation of knowledge is fundamentally not about the past, but about the future. Today, the future continues to be dependent on access to the knowledge of the past, and will be even more so as digital technology changes the way we can predict what will happen. It will also be contingent on how the knowledge created by our digital lives is harnessed for political and commercial gain. So there's the rub, isn't it?
Yes. And I think this is one of the things talking about, earlier moments of kind of complacency and neglect of the preservation of knowledge, like Alexandria. I think we're facing this today. So, the great tech companies are really managing the platforms in which the knowledge of today is being created and shared. And we've allowed them to take control over social memory, if I can put it like that. So every time we search on Google, every time we click like on Facebook or Twitter, every time we use our credit card for an online transaction, that knowledge, that activity is being monitored, it's being harvested, it's being pooled into online profiles of each of us. And of course, we're only just becoming aware of the scale of that online surveillance and what the purposes that are being used, that knowledge is being used for. So, of course, we've all known that it's been about targeting commercial advertising. We know that every time we search for, a hotel in Chicago, and the next time we go onto a newspaper, we get our adverts about flights to Chicago. But we now know that through the activities of bodies like Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, that that knowledge was being used to target political campaigning, both in the 2016 EU referendum in Britain, but also the 2016 presidential election, and elections all over the world. So, there are great archives of these online profiles that helped those campaigns to predict the future, going back to Ashurbanipal, predict the future voting intentions, likely voting intentions of millions of individuals. So they were then targeted not just to vote, but often targeted to suppress their voting, or often targeted to persuade them, nudge them in a particular direction. And so, we don't know the full extent of this because there is no archive of the Facebook political ads, for example. And so I think that, there are great examples of libraries and archives around the world trying to capture some of this information, but we're not doing it on the scale or with the frequency or the sophistication that we should for the sake of our society today, for the sake of democracy. And that's partly because we're just waking up to this as society, but also because we don't have the funds to keep pace with the incredible power that the big tech companies have, what our Oxford colleague Timothy Garton-Ash calls the private superpowers. And I argue in the book for a memory tax that could be levied against the profits of the big tech companies to enable us to create new forms of archive for the future that would have the interests of society and democracy at their heart.
So in essence, what you're saying is that the great libraries exist partly to empower their users. And that's the big difference with the aggregations of knowledge that is taking place by the internet giants, where it's simply to empower them.
Absolutely. That's a great way of putting it, Amanda. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, and we have to remember, you know, Derrida, you know, there is no political power without power over the archive.
Quite, and I think Orwell said something very similar. So we've got quite a few questions lined up. So I think I'm going to stop asking the questions now, and I'm going to throw it open to the questions that have been sent in. So the first comes from Helen Stubbs Pugin, who says, I'm enjoying this book immensely. One thing that has struck me already is that it's not always possible to judge the value of recorded knowledge until much later. So what does that mean? Do we have to save everything?
Well, I think this is why we need librarians and archivists to help make that judgment and to work with their communities, because it is quite difficult to predict what the future is going to find important. And at the same time, we can't save everything. And so one of the great Bodleian stories, not our finest hour, is back in the early 19th century, where because we've been a legal deposit library, we were entitled to free copies of the first editions of the great novels of the early 19th century, Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, the Brontes. But my predecessors said no. Why would we want fiction written by women? And so you know, the English faculty is then founded in the 1870s, and the professors come to find the first editions of the great writings of the previous century that they want to teach, and we don't have copies of them. So you know, we librarians and archivists don't get it right all the time, far from it. But I think we are better at understanding and working with our communities to try to decide what to keep and what not to keep, and the techniques of that preservation. So with big archival collections, there are techniques like sampling that can be used instead of having to keep every single financial record from a company archive. You know, we have the Marconi archive, for example. You can sample those, and there are well-versed sampling techniques in the archival domain that can help us get the sense of what was going on, rather than having to keep every single document.
Yeah, because there is so much. So the next question is a pivot. It's a historical question, and a rather interesting one actually, by Marilyn Bruce Mitford, who asks, when the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, what happened to the archives that were there? And all those classical documents, were they destroyed? Were they kept on later on by the Ottomans after they took over in 1453? Or were they just repurposed into something else? So where are those fabulous archives in Constantinople?
It's not an area I know a huge amount, but some of it ended up in Venice. So there are collections of books from Byzantium that ended up in other collections, partly through the actions of the Venetians. And then they were kind of subsequently disseminated, further kind of dispersals of those collections. Some of them ended up in Greek monastic libraries, like in places like Mount Athos or St. Catherine's in Sinai. There were destructions at the time, and we know only kind of fragments of text that were then used to bind Arabic and Ottoman Turkish documents of later periods, and some of them were preserved. So some of those collections are still to be found in libraries and archives in Istanbul.
Oh, okay. Michael Taylor reminds us that there is also that marvelous story about the Library of Timbuktu, where the various books were smuggled out, I think, in the middle of the night. Do you recall that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is a recent event. There's a fabulous book actually published about it a few years ago, and these great Islamic libraries, which were essentially curated by families, and over long periods of time. And of course, these were targeted by Al Qaeda, and they were smuggled out. There was a concerted campaign to support that, which was led by libraries in South Africa. And so, many of those collections actually survived the targeting by Al Qaeda, which of course, unfortunately, is not what happened in Iraq.
Well, I mean, it is extraordinary, isn't it? Chung Kyatso points out that, the urge to burn is one of the great international unifiers around the globe. That there is no really single civilization or nation who hasn't indulged in it, either against their own people or against others. In this case, Chung was talking about the first emperor of China, who had almost every single historical manuscript burned, including the original Confucian text. And what do you think that says about humanity, that we spend as much time burning our history as we do trying to preserve it?
Well, I'd like to flip that around the other way, because I think although there have been these, and I could have filled multiple volumes of my book with case studies of destruction, as you point out, that each of those times there are moments of preservation. So that impulse to preserve, to bear witness, to preserve the truth, to preserve falsehood, knowing that it's falsehood, so that individuals can be called to account, or just to preserve a community's history and past. These are deep within us. So every time that there are moments of those destruction, and I think those motivations are all about power and control and wanting to, either to just apply control over the past, or as Orwell warns us, to erase it and to insert a different truth, an alternative fact, as it were. I think that impulse to preserve is what I take great inspiration from every day in my job, and what helps to kind of enliven my profession and to motivate me through the book to bring this topic out as much as possible in public discourse, to get people talking about it, to raise awareness of it, to insert some of the ideas in public policy, because it is so important. And the fact that people like, the members of the Paper Brigade, that individuals in Bosnia, that the Zaydis in Yemen today, that people in Guatemala will risk their lives to preserve the truth, to preserve their own past or their own culture. I think that's what we should hold on to, rather than the moments of destruction. Let's celebrate and support the preservation.
Well, speaking of preservation, quite a few members of the audience have asked questions about both digitization and also the future role of AI.
Fantastic. Yeah, which brings us back to the new, the Schwarzman Center and the new library that we're planning there. And I think that, AI has an incredibly important part to play in the future of knowledge. We're seeing that because of its deployment by the big tech companies. But it can also, that has huge power to support society in all sorts of different ways. But AI needs data, it needs knowledge to be able to operate. And we can see that in, auto-translate functions. Google Translate is only good because it's been fed with lots of knowledge in the past to help train the AI engine. And I see this with the future of health. I don't know how many people in the audience wear a Fitbit or wear an Apple Watch and have their vital statistics monitored on, constantly through the day. Well, all of that data is now owned by the big tech companies. And I think it would be much better if we were able to harvest that for the good of society as a whole. And I think that's where libraries and AI and ethics can come together. And that's what I hope that we'll see in the New Humanities Centre with the Institute of AI Ethics, the philosophy faculty, our colleagues in the Oxford Internet Institute, and the library working together to build collections, build digital archives, inform the coders who are working on the development of the AI algorithms, and to help us understand the complex ethical issues that surround not just the application of the data, but where the data comes from, who controls it, who has the right to it. And I think that, Shoshana Zuboff, one of the great scholars working today in this field, has argued in our 700th anniversary conference that libraries could be data sanctuaries for people in the future.
And interestingly, as one of the members of the audience points out in the questions, that we may end up seeing creative works by AI. That up until now, the library has always collected works by humans, but there's a possibility. Would the body collect works by?
Of course it was, but we already collect knowledge that's not created by humans. We have, libraries and archives, including the Bodleian, have are preserving software. We have the first software in the Bodleian created by Ada Lovelace Byron, the great computer, the pioneer of computing, whose archive is in the Bodleian. So this is something that is really important today. It's going to become more important in the future. And, libraries and archives are on the case, absolutely, and working with the scholarly community. And I'm really excited about the new Humanities Library in the Richardson Centre, because it's going to be at the heart of these kind of new, the creation of new knowledge, but also the ways in which it will be managed and controlled and organised and disseminated and all of those things.
So I think on that happy and optimistic note, we can draw our conversation to a close. It's been absolutely fascinating, Richard, listening to you. It is such a timely and important book. And the questions that you pose are questions that we've all been thinking and mulling and worrying over. And the answers that you provide give us hope that there is a way forwards, and that way goes directly through libraries, through Oxford, through the Bodleian, through all the other great institutions that exist around the world, and all is not lost. So thank you very much. The book is Burning the Books. It's on sale at all good bookshops, and so I'm told on the internet.
Thank you very much indeed, Amanda. They were great questions, and thank you to everyone who came along. And it's something which I hope we can continue in Oxford when you come back, all of you, to visit us. Come and see us in the Bodleian, and we look forward to sharing knowledge with you for centuries to come.
Indeed. And thank you to Oxford North America, and once again to Vice-Chancellor Louise Richardson.